meat. This is food. And as you know, we talked about when we went through the book of Leviticus, being holy just means it had been dedicated to the Lord or sacrificed in some way. And so this holy food, you're holding it in the skirt of his garment. So they're holding a piece of holy meat in some kind of garment. He says if that garment were then to touch some other food item, would the fact that the meat that you were holding was holy, would that then make the other food items holy? And the priest answered no. And so he kind of asks then the reverse of this. He says, well, then if somebody were unclean because they had touched a dead body, and then they went and touched those same food items, would they now be considered unclean? And this time the priest answered yes. And so a principle is being established, which is holiness, or in this regard, ceremonial cleanliness. Holiness is not transferable, but ceremonial uncleanness is. And it's a principle, honestly, that applies far beyond the Mosaic law. I mean, simple things such as if you have a bowl of clean water and dirty water and you mix them, it's not going to become clean water. It's just going to be a bunch of dirty water. If you have a healthy person and a sick person sit together in a room, the sick person can make the healthy person sick, but the healthy person can't transfer their health to the sick person, right? It's a simple principle, and it applies. And so essentially what we can gather then, the fact that Haggai would ask this question, it seems as though the people had thought in their minds one of two things really. Either we can continue living in the same disobedient manner, not obeying the covenant that we have been, and God will bless us now because we're being obedient in this one issue of rebuilding the temple. Or alternatively, either they thought now that they had begun rebuilding the temple and, in this situation, began living right, that the chastisement of God based upon their previous unfaithfulness had simply not yet run its course. And so there's kind of two options here, but one way or another. The people thought simply because we become, that we're being obedient and we're returning now to the work of rebuilding the temple, that in of itself will stop all of the hardship we've been facing, all of the poor harvest, all of these things. They thought, we'll start putting stone on top of stone, and immediately our lives are going to be great. It's that fallacy that prosperity preachers key in on today, right? Just live by faith, do what the Bible says, and all your wildest prosperous dreams will come true, right? And so this is kind of where they were, what they were thinking. But clearly that was not the case. And so he tells them again in verse 15, he says, I pray you consider. And he's used this word several times in this very short book already. But consider, he says, from this day and upward, from before a stone was laid upon a stone of the temple, right? All of those times you came, you were looking for a heap of 20 measures, and there were 10. You came to the press vet to draw out 50, but you only got 20. There's poor return. There's poor harvest. I smote you with blasting, with mildew, hail in the labors of your hands. Why? Because you turned not to me. All right, so this is chastisement that simply has not yet ended. But they thought, we are unclean, but we're involved in the clean work of building the temple. So they thought the temple, the cleanness, the holiness of the temple would transfer to their state of uncleanness. And just by the fact that they were involved with the work of building the temple, that they were now holy, that they were now ceremoniously clean. And Haggai, through the priest really, had to teach them this really basic principle that that's really not how things work. And so again, they were trying to excuse wrong living just because they were doing this one thing right. And I think people are still guilty of the same thing today. And so God then gives them a promise of blessing, a promise of encouragement here. And so he says again, verse 18, consider now from this day and upward, from the 24th day of the month, from the day the foundation of the Lord's temple is laid, consider it. And he goes on to say at the end of verse 19, from this day will I bless you. And so again, as I mentioned, there's kind of two possibilities here. Either, number one, the people repented of the wrong things they were doing, and they started living right in accordance with the covenant, and God began to bless them. Or they had already started doing that, and the chastisement that God had placed upon them had now run its course, and now the blessing would commence. That's the way that Thomas Constable sees this. Let me quote him. He says, this oracle explained why agricultural blessing had not begun immediately after the people resumed reconstruction on the temple. Their present dedication and obedience did not wipe out their previous covenant unfaithfulness and its punishments. That punishment had to run its course, but now, as of the day of this prophecy, God would begin to bless the people with better harvest. And he says this message surely must have encouraged the Jews to persevere in their obedience. And again, that's the whole point of this, is Haggai is encouraging the people who had listened to his first oracle and begun the process of rebuilding. He's encouraging them to finish the rebuilding of the temple. And so here what was going to take place is God was going to show grace on an undeserving people. Right? This is what he's promising to do. This is what he has always done. Now, I want you to notice this, that this announcement of blessing came with an expectation of faith. It came with an expectation of faith built into the blessing. And so again, at the end of verse 19, from this day will I bless you. But at the beginning of verse 19, he says this, is the seed yet in the barn? He says, yea, is yet the vine of the fig tree, the pomegranate, the olive tree hath not brought forth. And so these are all staple items for the Jewish people living in this part of the world. And so here yet he says, but is the seed in the barn? No, we don't have seed in the barn. Why? Because we've had bad harvests. We don't have figs. We don't have pomegranates. The olive trees are not producing, from which they get oil and these things. We don't have these staple things, and yet we have to believe that from this day forward that God's going to bless us. And so even though we have no stores from which to rely upon, right, we have to have faith that what God says he will do. And so God says from this day forward, I will bless you. So even though we don't have money in the bank, so to speak, to use our vernacular, even though we don't have money in the bank, we still have faith that God is going to uphold his promises to us. It's again, faith being the requirement here. And so they had to have faith that God was going to accomplish the promises that he had bestowed upon them. And then we seemingly kind of switch gears here towards the end of the chapter. But Haggai gives what is a really important prophecy here, particularly for the Jewish people. And so verse 20 says, and again the word of the Lord came to Haggai, and this is the same day, the 24th day of the month, saying, speak to Zerubbabel, governor of Judah, saying, I will shake the heavens and the earth. I will overthrow the throne of kingdoms. I will destroy the strength of the kingdoms of the heathen. And I will overthrow the chariots, those that ride in them. The horses and their riders shall come down, every one by the sword of his brother. And that day, saith the Lord of hosts, will I take thee, O Zerubbabel my servant, the son of Shealtiel, saith the Lord, and will make thee as a signet, for I have chosen thee, saith the Lord of hosts. And so he has one more final message, and this one concerns a future leader, and I'll get to that, a future leader for the people of Israel. Now, for the first time here, I don't know if you noticed this, but in verse 21, for the first time, Haggai's message is for Zerubbabel only. So every time prior to this, it was for Zerubbabel, it was for Joshua, it was for the people. But here, it's just for Zerubbabel. Now, that could possibly indicate to us that the message is royal in nature, because Zerubbabel was royal by blood. He was the grandson of Jehoiachin, who was really the last legitimate Israelite king of Judah. And so he being from that direct bloodline, again, indicates that we're talking about something with royalty here. Now, again, God comes back to this message. He's going to shake the heavens and the earth. This is the second time he said this. We talked about this last week. He talked about this earlier in verse number 6 in chapter 2. But he comes back to this theme. And just like we said last time, this is judgment language. God's saying he's going to shake the heavens, he's going to shake the earth. This is judgment language. And this time it is much more clear, because he follows up this shaking with the results of the shaking. And so the result of shaking the heaven and the earth is the overthrow of the throne of kingdoms. That he's going to destroy the kingdoms of the heathen, that he's going to destroy their armies. And not only is he going to destroy their armies, but he's going to do it by infighting. Right at the end of verse 22, he says that everyone by the sword of his brother. And so civil strife will come into play. It kind of seems relevant. Civil strife will come into play, that these heathen armies will turn upon each other. And so here he's promising a blessing to Israel in the fact that their enemies, their natural enemies, are going to be defeated and they're going to be destroyed. And so when that happens, that all brings us to verse 23. When that happens, he's in that day, right? He's looking forward. In that day, saith the Lord, I will take Zerubbabel, and he says, I will make him a signet. I will take Zerubbabel, and I will make him a signet. Now, I'm sure everybody in here knows what a signet is, but a signet essentially was a symbol related to a ruler, and when that particular symbol was on a decree or a letter or something sent out by that king, by having that signet on it, it indicated that it had the full authority for the one to whom the symbol was related to. And so here, God says he was going to take Zerubbabel and make him his signet. And essentially saying, I'm going to place upon you the full authority of me. And so this is an interesting thing that God is saying with regards to Zerubbabel. And he tells him this because he says, I have chosen you. Now, this is significant for a lot of reasons, but not the least of which, if we were to look at the book of Jeremiah. In Jeremiah chapter 22, God gives another prophecy to Zerubbabel's grandfather, Jehoiachin. Okay, so in Jeremiah 22, he tells Jehoiachin, he says that though you are the signet upon my right hand, yet will I pluck thee thence. And so he tells Jehoiachin, again, Zerubbabel's grandfather, you are currently my signet, but I'm about to pluck you off. And he goes on to say later in that same chapter of Jeremiah, I'm going to give the signet to Nebuchadnezzar. My authority is leaving Israel. And again, this is very significant and would have been an incredibly weighty thing for the Jewish people to hear when you take into account the promises that God had made to David. And so you go back, way back in line to David, and God promises to David in 2 Samuel chapter 7 that a descendant from David would sit on the throne forever. And here, way down the line, you get to Jehoiachin, and God says, I'm removing my signet. In fact, I'm plucking it from you, and I'm giving it to somebody else. And so you have a period of time where the Jewish people were just in shambles, in captivity, obviously, but reeling from the fact that God has, from their perspective, seemingly removed his hand fully from them, and not only that, but reversed his promise. And so, again, you can understand the dejection that this people would have felt. Now, we understand that it was all in accordance to their own disobedience, their own rejection of him. But nevertheless, here, God reverses that, and he gives the signet back to another descendant of David. And so God, now again, we all got to understand that the timing here as well, because obviously in the life of Zerubbabel, God didn't overthrow all the Gentile nations. There wasn't civil strife everywhere, and all the Gentile nations were destroyed. That didn't happen. And furthermore, Zerubbabel is not still currently reigning on the throne of David. In fact, if you continue to study, as we will, you'll see that Zerubbabel just kind of quietly exits, and we don't really even know what happens to him. And so Zerubbabel then obviously is symbolic of something else. And so in that day then pushes us beyond the time of Zerubbabel. And Zerubbabel then obviously becomes a foreshadow of Christ. And so Zerubbabel then, a foreshadow of Christ, shows us that Christ was going to come, the Messiah was going to come, he was going to be in that line of David, not only the line of David, but in the line of Zerubbabel. And if you go look at Matthew 1, Luke 3, the genealogies of Christ, Zerubbabel is in both. And so Zerubbabel is in the direct line of Christ. And so another one was going to come in his line, in the line of David. He was going to be the political leader of Israel. He was going to be the one in charge when the Gentile nations are overthrown. Right? And so you can understand why prophecies like this led to the rejection of Christ by the Jews, not only in his time, but in our time still today. Right? Prophecies just like this are probably one of the main reasons why the Jews today still reject Jesus as the Messiah, because they'll say he didn't do this. And to their point, they're right. He hasn't done it yet. He didn't do it because, again, we talk about the New Testament, and there was a time of the Gentiles and the church, which was a mystery. Right? We constantly see that in the New Testament, that the church was a mystery, which means God didn't reveal it to the Old Testament prophets. And so the whole church age was something that the prophets had no idea about. And so they didn't know that there was going to be a heavenly kingdom started by the Messiah, and then that earthly reign and that earthly rule would come. And so again, it is prophecies like this that are significant not only to their understanding of the Messiah, but understanding to our understanding as well. Again, going back and seeing that line of Christ, which again, let me just throw in quickly. If a man were to rise up today and make messianic claims, there is no way that the Jews could verifiably say with any kind of accuracy that he was from the line of David. They can't. Those records were destroyed when the temple was destroyed in 70 A.D. Now, there are some families today who claim that they know that they're from the priestly line. It's just kind of oral tradition. But there's no way to verify it. And you can ask Jews today, they don't know what tribe they're from. Right? And this is significant because the Messiah has to be from the line of David. And so if somebody rises today, they can't make that claim because they don't know. And so anyways, this is, again, a significant prophecy with regards to Jesus being the Messiah, but also to why the Jews reject him as the Messiah. And so, again, very significant things happening here. And I want to close with a quote here from Frank Gabelin because he just kind of encapsulates the whole book. And I think he does it in a good way. So he says this, what then is Haggai saying to Christians today? He says, these four things constitute the basis of his message. These are his principles for serving the Lord. Number one, the Lord's work takes priority over every other obligation. Number two, those who obey God and work trusting in his abiding presence are kept from discouragement. Number three, the Lord's work demands clean instruments separated from sin. And number four, the Lord's work, believingly carried on, is linked to his sovereign plan for men and nations. And so here we have, again, I think that's a great encapsulation of this book. But Haggai, just 2 chapters long, but incredibly, incredibly important and relevant things here to find in this very, very short book, in this, what I find incredibly interesting prophet. And so we'll move on starting next week to Zechariah. And this is a much longer minor prophet. And so Zechariah has a lot to say, a lot of very interesting prophetic things that we'll get into with regards to that book. But, okay.